Hi, my name is Jackie Harrell, and I chose to do my presentation on the ecology of the mass media, children and screen media. So my observation location took place at Compass Public Charter School with Mrs. Cordero, who has 17 years of teaching experience. She's actually taught kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, and I had the joy of watching her teach some second graders. For the demographics, the average age was between 7 and 8 years old. The family income was low to moderate. The race was 23 Caucasian, 1 African refugee, and 1 Filipino. The class size was 25 students, with more girls versus boys. And there were 3 gifted and talented students and 4 RTI students. So the media affects socialization because they influence values, beliefs, attitudes, and behavior. The mass media are shapers, spreaders, and transformers of culture. The mass media are spreaders of culture in that they extend our capacity as human beings to process information, and in doing so, transform us in some way. And the mass media are transformers of culture in that new media creates new environments as well as new ways of looking at existing environments, which I think we can all relate to with just the way technology has transformed over time. So there are 4 main theories behind this. We have our social cognitive theory, our cultivation theory, motivation theory, and displacement theory. And I'm going to go over each one of those. So our social cognitive theory is the media contributes to children's learning by enabling them to observe role models and how they behave on screen. Children identify with role models perceived to have a certain prestige. Active behavior is more likely to be intimidated than passive behavior. If the role model's behavior is rewarded, for example, if they get a medal or if they receive some kind of recognition, it is also likely to be intimidated. Children can learn positive or negative things from TVs and movies, and their consequent behavior depends on other variables, which I'll talk about later, especially adult mediation. And then we have our cultivation theory, which is believe that media content affects viewers' beliefs about the world and consequently alters their behavior. So, for example, exposure to violent media leads to a belief that aggression can resolve problems with no adverse effects. According to cultivation theory, the more time that one is exposed to violence, the more likely that individual will engage in violent acts. Then we have motivation theory, which is the belief that the impact of media depends on how the media is used. So whether it's used for entertainment, for learning, if it's just, background noise, and then the individual's abilities and characteristics of the user. So since young children are more susceptible to media influence due to their cognitive immaturity, they just don't have the skills to evaluate what they view since they're so gullible, since they're so young, and whether media is used alone, with peers, or with adults makes a difference in socialization outcomes for children. Then we have our displacement theory, which, according to some researchers, media used for entertainment may displace important developmental activities such as play, hobbies, just being able to do free play, play outside, playing games, reading, getting that imagination flowing. And especially when it comes to conversations with family and even friends, and I'll touch on that later too. So, for example, the active process of reading a book, imagining those characters and developing that vocabulary is so important when you're a child. So then I'll move to the 3 main variables. So we have the child variables, which include age, cognitive ability, gender, social experience, and psychological needs. Cognitive skills. being the way that your brain uses to think and read, learn, remember, reason, and pay attention. All of this working together, they take the incoming information and then they move it into that bank of knowledge, and then they use it every single day at school. So back to what I said earlier about the displacement theory, to being able to read and imagine those characters in a book and whatnot. That's so important when it comes to the classroom environment. Then you have the family variables, which include economics, which is affecting what media is purchased, such as video games, CDs, MP3 downloads. You've got the time, including leisurely activities that are pursued, the games, the sports, trips, and then the mediation, which I mentioned earlier, which is how much adult supervision accompanies the media exposure. I found that the less media exposure that kids have with adult, or the more media exposure that kids have without their parents around, the less likely they are to engage in free play. Then you have the bi-directional variables, which includes what the child brings to the media experience to change it. So, for example, not all things can be negative just because a child spends a lot of time in front of the screen, or that they know a lot. Can be a good thing. If you have a child who has a lot of computer knowledge, then that can be a good thing, and how they use it for learning. Then you have how the media experience changes the child, how the child experiences life, and that would then, of course, be the negative. So then you have the 5 main concerns. You have the socio-emotional development and relationships, the physical development and health, the psychological development and behavior, cognitive development and achievement, and then the moral development and the values. So I'm going to touch on how I saw all of those things in action in the classroom. So, for example, when I was observing the students and how they were playing, I definitely did see a lot of kids who, when I was listening to them play, they were, playing the different things that are very common right now, like zombies and being part of a zombie apocalypse. So, that led me to believe that they watched a lot of those kinds of shows, and it affected the way that they played. Not necessarily in a negative way, but it definitely affected them. And it also affected them with their books and their choice of books. In the classroom, some of the books that they were, like one of the books that they were reading was Mr. Popper's Penguins. And, that's a relatively small book, but some of the books that I noticed that they had on their desks that they were able to read in their free time were books like Lord of the Rings and some of these other ones like Harry Potter. They're these larger books, for one, and then two, it's out there. They see it on TV and everyone else is reading them, and it definitely had an impact on that. And then you've got their attitudes and just how they interact with one another. That kind of goes along with the peer interaction there that's on the list also. And then you have your stereotypes. And yes, kids definitely have stereotypes already at this age. What they think about things, what their opinions on things, and how the mass media shapes and influences that, even by some of the commercials that they will see when they're watching TV, and maybe even some of the different ads that pop up when they're online. With those peer interactions again, and even the adult interactions, that can affect the way that they talk to each other, which I did see. So to evaluate and analyze. So in general, proponents of media innovation argue that the new technology benefits children by opening up new worlds to them, while opponents argue that new media might be used to substitute for real life in learning ethical principles, undermining children's morality. So I definitely saw both of these things take place. And if we're talking the pedagogy, which is the function or work of a teacher, the art of teaching and education and instructional methods, how it was applied in Mrs. Cordero's classroom was it for language arts, for example. This was probably one of the best things that really stuck out to me and that I noticed a lot, was when they were reading different books, one of them being Mr. Popper's Penguins. And then there was another history book that they were reading. She made non-biased influences in her instruction to her students. She provided them with multiple examples based on facts and allowed students to collaborate with one another. So it was definitely evident that she wants to teach based on well-rounded facts, allowing for her students to come up with their own worldview, which is definitely different than, the mass media. They shared time to help strengthen their ideas and their thoughts with some of these books that they were reading. They were, they even played a couple of games, and they engaged in different imaginative exploration activities. If children have few experiences listening to others and responding to them and negotiating with them and compromising, their socio-emotional development will be negatively affected. So in the check for understanding, I'll have you take out a piece of paper and write a paragraph on which theory you believe holds the most weight, keeping mass media in mind. Be sure to include a personal example of your own life experience in a class you have observed, or even with your own children. For a bonus, you can share an example of when you were influenced as a child by some form of mass media or screen media, and then post your response in the comments section underneath this initial post. And then these are my references. Thank you for listening.